I would like to show you today the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop in terms of handling type. So if I type a letter in Illustrator, for example, there it is, it's right in here, and I zoom really, really closely to that letter, you can see how beautifully sharp it's going to stay. If I actually work in Photoshop, and I type the same exact letters, the same exact typeface, and I zoom really, really closely to that, the difference is pretty dramatic. Let me go back into Illustrator and put them next to each other, hopefully. There it is. And even in Illustrator, trust me, if I zoom even closer in Illustrator, I still, Command plus, I can zoom as close as you want me to zoom, but the D is going to still look beautifully sharp. That's a big difference between vector and bitmap. I'm going to actually close Illustrator right now because what I would like to talk about is Photoshop. Photoshop is always associated to photography and color correcting, but it can do a whole lot more than that. In fact, Photoshop is very, very strong these days in drawing. If you think about, Pixar and doing, becoming a digital artist that does character design, definitely Photoshop would be the tool you want to know. I'm going to actually delete the D right now. So you can definitely draw and input content through a stylus or just, go and get a paintbrush and draw in Photoshop. Right now I hit B and it went right into this pencil tool or brush tool. They're both B. And you can go in and just, use the square brackets to make it bigger or smaller. And you can go in and input a line. Now, if I zoom onto this line, I want to show you something really cool. And this is called anti-aliasing. That is, even though the line I picked was red, it's supposed to be red, and the background is white, if you look at the line, and the edges of the line have a whole lot of pink in it. There's a transition between the red and the white, and that's called anti-aliasing. The brush tool is an anti-aliasing tool. Now let's see how the pencil tool works. Let's go back to B. You remember the brush and pencil are underneath the same. And this time you can already tell a little bit from the cursor that now when I go in and create a line with this time is the pencil tool, the anti-aliasing is missing. This time the line is with basically very hard contrast between the line and the background. Now you might wonder, how is it that it looks so washed out? Because my setting for the pencil are saying that the opacity is at 30%. So I need to go up here and bump it up to 100% if I want my line to be really red. But it almost hurt, doesn't it? It means your pencil tool is what you called hard alias versus the brush tool is anti-alias. Keep in mind that in Photoshop, most of your tools are going to bring in content are actually going to be anti-aliased. For example, if I create another layer, I'm going to turn this off, and I create, for example, a shape. I'm going to go through this. It's called the marquee tool. And I create a rectangular marquee or an elliptical marquee. And I'm going to click and drag. And then I'm going to go and do edit fill, or by the way, option delete will fill it as a shortcut. Option delete on your keyboard. It will fill it with the top color. Now I'm going to do Command D to deselect, and I'm going to zoom onto the edges to check if it's alias or anti-alias. And you can see that it is indeed anti-alias. It has that transition between the red and the white with a series of pink. So keep in mind that by default, you're going to generate mostly anti-aliased content, except for certain tools like the pencil tool that is notoriously a hard alias tool. So we just noticed, though, that we can bring in content in Photoshop through the what we call marquees. So I can do a shape of any kind, square or ellipse, and I can decide which color I want. I can double click in here, so I want a kind of a blue color, and I can do Option Delete, or if you like better to use the top menu, you can do Edit Fill. Let me see if I get there. As I said, I kind of love to use shortcuts, but that's me. But if you go under Edit Fill, I do want to show you something important if you prefer to use the top menu. Be careful that here says foreground color, because sometimes it will say content aware, and that's something we'll talk about it later, not at the first class. But be aware that it was not going to work. Content aware pattern is going to be a problem, or any of these. You really have to have the foreground color or the background or a specific color you choose. But it's much easier to just have the foreground as the default. And again, I'm going to do Option Delete just because I like to use the shortcut. But one way to input content in Illustrator, sorry, in Photoshop, I apologize, I was talking about Illustrator earlier. One way to input content is using the marquee. And to get rid of the marquee, you do Command D for deselect. Now be aware that there are various modes to the marquee tool. This is new selection, this is add to the selection, this is subtract, and this is intersections. It will consider the intersection between the selections you make. So for example, if I create an initial selection right here, and then I say, oh gosh, I need to add a circle to that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first switch to the circle. I want to show you why actually I'm doing this. But then if I say I want to add, I'm okay, and I'm going to go in and click and drag, and we'll add to the circle. Now, if you don't first switch, if you actually choose add and then switch, sometimes it is a little buggy. That's why I'm saying that it's smarter to first switch the shape and then go into add. Let's say I want to subtract something to it. I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to say I want to actually subtract a shape up here. Oops, it's going to do it right there. So that's kind of one way to create shapes and then fill them with color. So creating shapes in Photoshop is kind of one way to bring in content. Another way is obviously just going in and bringing in something you have in the, for example, in the clipboard. Let's say you went to a different file, copied something, and then you do Command Paste. So let me go in there. Let me try to find, for example, a image. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go here and say copy image. And then you can obviously go in Photoshop right here. Oops, sorry about this. Too many browser windows open. And then I can do Command V, and all of a sudden we have that image in Photoshop. So just to have a little bit of a quick panorama on Photoshop is remember the idea of bringing in content through the marquee, bringing in content through copy and paste, this concept of aliasing and anti-aliasing. And then one last thing I wanted to show you is if you create a new file, just like in Illustrator, this is actually something that I didn't specify in Illustrator, but is quite important. If you say print right here, you'll see that the resolution is going to be 300. And 300 means it's very high. And generally, when we think of print and resolution, we think about DPI, that stands for dots per inch. And it's because we're intending to print this document. When you say File, New, and you say Create, it will create a document that is 300 DPI. Also, if you're printing, the traditional workspace is CMYK. And then you can decide if the background is white or transparent, or black or whatever you want. But be aware that there's this idea that if you do a print document, or it means the output is going to be printed, you want to make sure you have a high DPI, and dots per inch is because the printer will shoot these little dots on the paper. Now, if you decide to instead go with a web application, notice what happens right here when I switch to web, okay, guys? You'll see that the resolution does not need to be that high. 72 is plenty, and generally we think at this time at PPI, or pixel per inch, because this time we're not, and by the way, you also have the centimeter option that I don't think you're interested in, but pixel per inch means this time we don't have to shoot any dots of ink on paper, so PPI is all we need. You obviously can input in here the size of your document. In this case, it's some kind of custom size, but you can also choose that you want a letter size instead, and that is 8.5 by 11. And here you have oftentimes, if you click on View All Presets, you have option for web versus for, like you can say, okay, I'm going to go with a small web that is generally 1280 by 800 at 72 dpi. So you can choose that, or you want a medium, is going to be a little bit bigger, and etc., etc. So these are the standard size for a web layout. Notice they're all horizontal, right? Because screens tend to be horizontals when we're dealing with web. Obviously, mobile is going to be different because it's going to have more like mobile means we're looking at it on a phone. So we're going to start having stuff that is more vertical. Versus if we go for print, it can be either way at that point. Print is generally has a traditional letter, legal, tabloid, and these are European sizes. So what I want to tell you is this difference between the 300 DPI at, sorry, I was looking down if I was CMYK or not. By the way, even though you go on print, why do I have RGB in there? Why doesn't it switch automatically to CMYK? Because in the late 90s, a group of people came up with a standard, we call this color management system, by which now it doesn't really matter actually if you start your document in CMYK or RGB if you're printing, because everything goes through the translation of color management, and that's a different lecture that we'll have to do later. But bottom line is everything gets, when you hit that print button, goes through a module that translate whatever color space you start from to the color space that the printer needs. That's why when I switch to print, it doesn't switch automatically to CMYK. But remember, traditionally CMYK is what is associated with printing, even though, again, because of color management now is not as critical. Instead, when you switch to web, you will see that RGB is the standard, and this time instead of 300 you need 72. Also remember that whenever you're thinking of printing, that resolution is indicated as DPI for dots per inch, versus when we're talking about web or screen output, we'll always think of PPI, that is pixel per inch, because we're dealing with a screen and pixels. We don't have to shoot any dots of ink on paper if we're dealing with a web or mobile output. So that's what I wanted to tell you just for today. All right.